Hello and welcome to this Community Writing Center workshop. The Community Writing Center provides individual writing consultations and writing workshops for all writers in the Great Lakes Bay region, free of charge. To learn more about our services, including virtual and face-to-face feedback on your writing, upcoming writing workshops, and our various writing contests and events, please visit our website at www.communitywritingcenter.com. This online workshop series is sponsored by funding from the Bay Area Community Foundation and the SVSU Center for Community Writing. Hi, I'm Kelly Fitzpatrick, a Michigan-based author and educator, and it is my pleasure to present to you the second session in our fiction writing series, which will focus on the skill of using dialogue. Thank you for joining us, and let's get started. Welcome to our workshop on using dialogue. The purpose of this workshop is to learn how to use effective dialogue in fiction writing. This workshop is appropriate for all levels, including beginners, and it will last approximately 90 minutes. You'll need a notebook and a writing utensil, and this is optional, but if you have the draft of a current story in progress, you're welcome to have it handy because you'll be able to use it for one of the activities if you so choose, but it's optional. All of our workshops aim to create an inclusive, respectful, and productive environment for all writers. We aim to provide feedback, strategies, and resources writers need to improve their writing, and to encourage collaboration between writers through active conversation and participation. Here's a preview of what you can expect during this workshop. We'll open with a quick write and discussion of our responses. Then we'll move into a craft talk on different usages of dialogue in fiction. We'll look at some mentor texts as examples, and there'll be opportunities for guided practice. Then we'll use a writing prompt to have some extended writing time for applying these skills. And then we'll finish with some analysis and takeaways for your own writing. Let's start with our opening quick write to get our creative juices flowing. So for this quick write, you will be able to choose one of the following scenarios. So the first one is an adult and a child fishing on a lake, a business person and their boss sitting in a meeting, or two friends at an outdoor art festival. Now what I'd like you to do is imagine that one of these characters wants to leave the place where they are. And then you're going to write the conversation that takes place between those people with one of them wanting to leave. If possible, try to include how the other person responds as well as the outcome. So do they actually leave the place that they're at? We're going to spend about 5 minutes writing. Don't worry if you're not sure exactly how to express the dialogue. Just try to let it flow and see what comes out on the page as you imagine this situation. We have about 30 seconds remaining of writing time if you'd like to wrap up where you're at. All right, hopefully you were able to get a conversation written between your characters. And now we're going to go back and sort of do some meta-analysis of what we wrote. And I'm going to give you a preview of the instructions here, but then we're going to look at an example response together, kind of tear it apart, and then I'll give you a few minutes to go back and analyze your own piece of writing, just to kind of get a feel for the moves that we're naturally making. So the instructions here say to go back to your writing and ask the following questions. What are your characters literally saying? So this would just be a couple sentence summary of what it is that they're actually talking about. What else did your dialogue reveal or imply to the reader? So this requires digging a little bit deeper and looking at it from the perspective of a writer and asking, how are these characters made more real to us? And if you were present for the first session of our fiction workshop series, think back to some of those elements of characterization that we talked about, such as background, personality, motivations, struggles, relationships, etc. And then the other aspect of that is, are there any conflicts or plot events that are revealed through that dialogue that you wrote? And then finally, and this is just a brief note here, how did you indicate which character was speaking? So did you use dialogue tags? Did you break paragraphs? How did you kind of indicate on the page, if you did so, which character was speaking? So I'm going to have you do this, but first we're going to look at an example. So here's an example response to the prompt about two business people in a meeting. So I'm going to read it, and then we'll analyze it and look for those elements. Hey, I need to step out for a few minutes. Kathy leaned across the table toward her boss, Amila. The rest of the room murmured in group brainstorm mode. Trent just texted me. The school tour group showed up early. Amila frowned. We're in the middle of solving a major crisis here. I told the entire team to clear their schedules. Kathy sighed. I told you how to avoid this crisis 5 months ago. I sent you my recommendations for fixing it last week. You literally have all my knowledge on the matter already. And there are currently 35 middle schoolers gallivanting about the lobby. I'm leaving. We'll talk about this later. Right, she said, pushing through the glass door. All right, let's apply our analysis questions to this example response. And the first one just says, what is the conversation literally saying? And in this case, Kathy wants to leave the meeting to attend to the visiting students, but her boss, Amila, wants her to stay. That's the actual content of what they're literally talking about in the words that they're saying out loud. But then there's more that is implied about the characters, and we actually get some plot events happening within this conversation. So I actually want to show you these things in the text itself. So let's look at the plot events first, and that's in this purple color. And there are 3 in this section. So the first event that happens is that the inciting incident shows up. So that is when Trent texts Kathy and lets them know, hey, we have students waiting down here. So that kind of starts this whole issue between them. And then the next plot event is Kathy making a decision of how she's going to handle the situation. And in this case, it's I'm leaving. And then the third event is the response from Amila that we'll talk about this later, which implies consequences for our main character for her decision. So think about plot events as things that happen. These are changes in the environment that move the story forward. And in this case, all 3 of them came across in dialogue. Now, there's also several elements of characterization going on here for both Amila and Kathy. We find out that Amila is somewhat of an assertive person because she says, you know, I'm leaving. She just decides she's going to do that in conversation with her boss. And we also find out that there's a difference in priorities here between them and quite a bit of friction. Amila is more focused on the task at hand, and she is not appreciative that Kathy is going against her directives. We find out this is a long-standing feud over this crisis, so there's a lot that we find out about the backstory. We even get some of Kathy's personality coming through in her tone here in the way that she responds somewhat sarcastically. And then just looking at how this excerpt is showing us who's speaking. So if you notice on the top one here, there isn't the word said, it just says Kathy leaned across the table towards her boss, Amila. So we know who's talking because we get Kathy's name in that line of action. And then we have two more lines of action, and then we have what's called a dialogue tag on the last one down here that she said as she pushes through the door. So pretty basic, but just helping us know who's talking in each paragraph. So now we'll return to this set of instructions that we talked about, and I'll give you several minutes to go through your own writing and try to identify anything that's there and what it's doing, so we kind of get a handle on what you are naturally inclined to do when writing a conversation, and then we'll build on that through the rest of the workshop. Let's talk a little bit about craft. So dialogue is when a writer lets their reader hear the voices of the characters directly. This includes two or more characters talking to each other, a character talking out loud to themselves, or a character thinking to themselves, which is called internal dialogue. Dialogue often shows the character's thoughts toward the situation, as well as their attitudes towards their fellow characters. Dialogue can happen at any point in the plot. Dialogue is typically formatted using quotation marks and descriptors called dialogue tags. So here's an example from Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. A trader from Karth once told me that dragons come from the moon, blonde Doria said as she warmed a towel over the fire. So the dialogue tag is Doria said, and it's combined here with a modifier and also an action. Internal dialogue, which is a direct thought, is typically italicized to set it off as different from spoken dialogue. So here's another example from the same book. Stone, she told herself. Even Illyrio said so. The dragons are all dead. So this is a thought that one of the characters is thinking to themselves in their mind. And another really important formatting thing for dialogue is that you should always start a new paragraph whenever a new speaker starts talking or whenever the speaker changes. So think about each paragraph being owned by one character, so to speak. As far as purpose goes, dialogue can be used to accomplish many purposes in a story, but the two main ones that we're going to discuss today are characterization and advancing the plot. Characterization means helping the reader to get to know who the characters are and what they want. And we did our first session on that, so you should have some idea of that. Or if you haven't got a chance to view that workshop yet, I would encourage you to do so at some point. And then the second purpose is advancing the plot. This means an event occurs that heightens or releases tension, presents a complication, or forces a character to make a decision. So in other words, stuff happens, and dialogue can be used as a vehicle to make stuff happen in the story. Here are two bonus uses that we won't go into as much detail for, but we will look at briefly. One of them is world building, which means establishing a setting within your fiction and making it realistic and believable. And the other one is theme, and this is where you convey main ideas or hint at the message of the piece that you're trying to write. And again, either of these things can be accomplished in world building. I will say that all of these things can be accomplished many different ways. Dialogue is just one way, but that is our focus for today. So if we're looking at our first purpose of characterization, how can you do that using dialogue? Well, you could show readers how a character reacts to their surroundings and where their attention is focused. So in any given situation, each person is going to zero in on some aspect of that event, and by allowing us to see that or know that through dialogue, that's going to give us an idea of what kind of person they are. You can let readers hear each other's unique speaking style. Let readers hear each character's unique speaking style because no two characters will have identical voices. So by allowing us to hear them talk out loud, they become discrete and unique in our minds. Allow the characters' motivations, struggles, and insecurities to flavor their dialogue. So this has to do with voice, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this in our point of view workshop in session 3. But each person, or each character rather, is going to have some snarly stuff going on inside of them, and if those little things sort of pull on the lines of dialogue, that helps to characterize them. You can show the relationships between characters. So we saw this in the example Quick Write, where there was a bunch of tension between Kathy and her boss. Likewise, a lot of times dialogue can be used to talk about relationships, to demonstrate relationships, even if it's just through the tone. You could replace some said tags with an action. Again, we saw this earlier, and we'll look at it more in a second. So instead of putting said so-and-so after every time somebody speaks, you can play with this a little bit, and one variation is to replace the tag altogether with a line of action. So here we have rubbish. Terry chucked another log onto the fire. We'll make it out of here. So it's implied that Terry is saying that as they are chucking the log onto the fire. So here's some more examples of how you might characterize with dialogue. If you have two characters who are speaking to each other and you want to show that one of them is from Texas, you might insert some colloquial Southern language into their speech patterns. If your character is shy, you might write them to be stammering to show that they're unsure of themselves. If they are rude, you might have them have a habit of interrupting other characters while they're speaking. Again, the possibilities here are endless. Just a quick cautionary note on dialect. Typically, you want to avoid I dialect or phonetic spelling of words, as they often reinforce harmful stereotypes about education, intelligence, status, etc., and it's also very hard to read. So instead of writing this first line here, just ask him, I ain't got nothing to do with none of that, consider writing it just ask him, I ain't got nothing to do with none of that. They actually sound very similar, spoken out loud. And there's enough voice and unique word choice in the second one, in the syntax of that second sentence, to make it unique. So we have the word ain't, we have triple negatives going on in the sentence. There's a lot of uniqueness in that second voice without having to mess with the spellings and make it difficult to read. So what about our other main purpose, advancing the plot? How might you go about doing that with your dialogue? One way is that you could choose to reveal important plot events through dialogue. So one of my favorite examples of this occurs in the novel 1984 by George Orwell, and there's a pivotal scene where the characters discover that they're being watched, and the way they do that is a line of dialogue announces itself just in the middle of their conversation. And it's very chilling for the reader and a very effective use of spoken dialogue. You could also have a character verbalize their decision at a juncture in the story. So this occurs in Shakespeare's Hamlet when the main character, Hamlet, says, the play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. So in that line, he's exclaiming that he has made a decision, one of the very few he makes in the play, to try to catch the king and get evidence that he needs in that particular way. You could have characters discuss the possible choices they might make and the potential outcomes. This isn't a plot event per se, it's more like the characters verbalizing for the sake of the reader what the potential outcomes are, but what that does is it demonstrates the stakes. We know what is at stake for them if they choose X, Y, or Z. I've seen this done many times in several books. In one of the examples we're going to look at in a second from The Trader Brew Cormorant, there's an entire scene where she discusses with her assistant what her possible next political moves are, and that's a good example of that technique. Characters might narrate events to others who aren't present as they happen. There's a scene in The West Wing, the TV show, where the president is on the phone with a sailor who is at sea during a hurricane and their whole fleet is stuck. And the viewer is not seeing any of that action happen. We're hearing it through the telephone, through the voice of this sailor, through the conversation. And it's very, very powerful, very chilling. Characters can give orders, they can deny access to someone, they could threaten someone, like in Frankenstein, when the monster tells his creator, Victor, I will be with you on your wedding night, which is very much a threat and foreshadowing. So dialogue really can make things happen, even though it's words. Really, anything that heightens tension or releases it is going to count as a plot event. So for example, if your character's marriage is on the rocks, you could write a tense argument that occurs between the two rather than telling your reader directly that their relationship is ending. If two characters are falling in love, a flirtatious conversation between the two might work to smoothly move their relationship forward. If your character has a secret, having it be accidentally revealed in conversation would effectively build tension. So let's talk about our bonus uses here. The first one is that dialogue can be used to world build. Now, to do this, you can work in a few spoken references to the conditions of the setting. So for example, the weather, the temperature, noise level, smells, lighting, etc. So here's an example. Never seen a green sky before, Morris said. Gil shrugged. Happens sometimes before a Michigan storm. You could also mention place names, references to traditions or local happenings, and regional colloquialisms in dialogue to help world build if appropriate to the story. So it's really important in most stories that you create a vivid sense of place, of setting, and dialogue is one way that you could work in references to that so we really feel like we're there. Dialogue can also be used to hint at themes in a story, and this is one of my favorite ways to use it. One way to do this is to mirror a larger abstract theme in your story. Let's say it's dealing with chaos in a smaller concrete event in the plot, such as an object breaking, and then let your characters discuss it. How the heck is that tire flat again? Abdul said. I literally just replaced it, like 3 weeks ago. You think I know how to fix stuff? Ken laughed. Have you seen my life lately? So here we have this theme of chaos being reflected in the flat tire, but it allows them to get to that important thing naturally. Some things to keep in mind. On a first draft, try to let the dialogue flow naturally as you write, rather than worrying about getting it exactly right on the first time. You can always revise it later. Some stories rely on large amounts of dialogue, such as Lord of the Flies. You can open that book to almost any page and you'll have a giant chunk of dialogue there. While other stories have almost no dialogue, such as Life of Pi, since the main character is stranded at sea for most of the story and has no one to talk to. Dialogue is not necessary to create a story. You can write one that has no dialogue in it, and that is perfectly fine. This is just one tool of conveying meaning in a story. Not all stories follow standard formatting for dialogue, so the overwhelmingly popular convention is to use quotation marks, but Cormac McCarthy's books do not. Neither does Chemistry by Weike Wang, which was an example in the characterization workshop. So just understand that these are guidelines and not hard rules. There are some types of dialogue that you typically want to avoid. One of them is "as you know, Bob" dialogue, which refers to non-natural dialogue that is forced into a story for the benefit of the reader. This is where your characters both already know something and they really have no reason to discuss it with each other, but the story makes them discuss it so that the reader can hear it. And in this case, you want to find a different way to convey that information rather than an unnatural conversation. Information stuffing means including a bunch of mundane details in the conversation that might happen in real life but are not relevant to the story. So this might be a lot of small talk, or it might be details about the trip over when really the heart of the conversation is something else. And so you can use your judgment on how much of that to leave in. You can certainly have a meaningful conversation that is nothing but small talk, and sometimes those tense pauses can be meaningful, but it depends on what you're trying to convey with that particular conversation. Avoid rehashing what the audience already knows in order to get the rest of the characters up to speed. Shakespeare does this sometimes in his plays, so it can be done well, but typically if the audience already knows something, there's no need to have the characters tell it again to each other. It's okay to just summarize and say, he explained what had happened at work, and just move on from there. Try to avoid fancy dialogue tags. Usually the word "said" works fine, and "said" is almost invisible. Readers won't notice it there, while if you use more ornate tags like "exclaimed exuberantly," readers will notice those, and they tend to distract from the dialogue itself. That's not to say that you can't use other words, and I'm going to show you some examples that do use some other words, but you just want to be aware of this and err on the side of less is more. All right, let's look at some of our mentor texts that have some examples of dialogue being used effectively, and I'll give you some chances to see if you can spot it and spot the uses and the purposes that it is fulfilling. Our first example comes from The Golem and the Genie, which is a 2013 novel by Helene Wecker. And from the excerpt that is on the next slide, I'm going to give you just a little bit of setup here for the story. The genie has awakened, or has been awakened, by Tinsmith Arbely, who is now trying to help the genie adjust to living in New York City in 1899. And this is an actual genie who is now in mostly human form. In the scene, they are inside of Arbely's tiny apartment, which the genie has just called shabby. So he's basically just insulted Arbely's living space. So here is the excerpt, And I'm going to read it, and then I want you to see if you can tell what is the dialogue accomplishing in this passage. Is it characterizing or is it advancing the plot? They'd been acquainted for little more than a week, but already Arbeli had realized that if their arrangement was to work, he'd have to curb his irritation at the genie's offhand slights. "What more do I need?" he said. "I spend all my time at the forge. When I'm here, I'm asleep." Gesturing to the walls, he said, "We could string a sheet across and bring in a cot so you don't have to sleep in the shop anymore." The genie looked at Arbeli as though he'd suggested something insulting. "But I don't sleep in the shop." "Then where have you been sleeping?" "Arbeli, I don't sleep." All right, I'll give you a few seconds to see if you can decide what is the dialogue doing in this passage. Is it characterizing or is it advancing the plot? Do you have your guess? All right, as always, you may find some things that I did not, but in this passage, I think most of the dialogue here is characterizing both Arbeli and the genie. So this dialogue shows that Arbeli is a man of simple means, who works long hours, who is kind enough to share his living space. He says, "What more do I need?" And even though the space is tiny, he is trying to come up with ways to bisect it so that they can share it. And then for the genie, we find out a rather important piece of information, which is that he does not need to sleep since he's a magical being. This will become important later in the story. And rather than the story just telling us that in the narration, they revealed it through a conversation with Arbeli. Our next example comes from the classic novel The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And this excerpt is from chapter 7 in the novel. And the setup for this is Daisy is married to Tom, and Daisy has an affair with Gatsby. Gatsby wants Daisy to leave Tom to be with him, and the whole day up till this point in the story has been very tense and awkward. Tom has started openly questioning Gatsby's character, and the scene is narrated by Gatsby's friend Nick. So for this one, I'm going to give you a hint that there's both characterization and a plot event happening, so I want to see if you can spot them. Daisy rose, smiling faintly, and went to the table. "Open the whiskey, Tom," she ordered, "and I'll make you a mint julep. Then you won't seem so stupid to yourself. Look at the mint." "Wait a minute," snapped Tom. "I want to ask Mr. Gatsby one more question." "Go on," Gatsby said politely. "What kind of a row are you trying to cause in my house, anyhow?" They were out in the open at last, and Gatsby was content. "He isn't causing a row." Daisy looked desperately from one to the other. "You're causing a row. Please have a little self-control." I'll give you a few moments to identify where is the characterization within the dialogue and where is the plot event, where's the thing that happens that changes the situation. All right, let's see what we have here. So here's what I found for characterization and plot. The plot event is in pink, and this is where Tom comes out and basically confronts Gatsby about meddling in his household with the affair. So this is really the turning point in this chapter, and maybe you could say in the novel, of dragging this issue of the affair completely out into the open, where before it had kind of been secret. Then we have a couple pieces of characterization here. So we have Daisy characterized as thinking that Tom is stupid and lacking in self-control. And you could maybe say that by trying to get him to focus on the mint and the alcohol, she's trying to distract from the issue. So she's very anxious about the outcome of this conversation. Gadsby is characterized as being relatively calm and polite in this part of the chapter anyway, versus Tom. So there's kind of a contrast going on there. So we have all of them sort of showing their true colors in this scene. And then I wanted to point out briefly the dialogue tags that are happening in this scene, because these are some examples of words other than said that are working fairly effectively. So we do have in the center here, Gadsby said politely, so we have an adverb tacked on there. And that's rather important because we need to know how he said it, because that line could be interpreted in multiple ways. And same for Tom's line and Daisy's line up above. Those lines could be said very differently. So wait a minute, I want to ask Mr. Gadsby one more question would sound very differently if he was pleading versus him snapping. So in this case, these words help us to understand the tone of what's going on, and they're very effective at doing that. Notice down below, Fitzgerald uses a line of action, Daisy looked desperately from one to the other, versus a dialogue tag. So there's that technique of replacing them, especially if it's in between two pieces of dialogue. It can be very effective. Our next mentor text is There There by Tommy Orange. And in this excerpt, Jackie Redfeather is texting with her sister. Orville is her sister's son. And I want you to notice how the texts are italicized to indicate written dialogue. So technically, text messages, letters, or other type of written correspondence can function very similarly to dialogue. And sometimes it follows the same behaviors that dialogue or internal dialogue does. And in this case, the text messages are set up very much like a conversation. So here's the excerpt, and same question, what is the dialogue accomplishing in this passage? But I have a hint down here that there is a theme present in this section. Jackie walked to the window to see if the pool was still empty. Her phone vibrated on the bed. Orville found spider legs in his leg, the text said. WTF, Jackie texted back, but the sentence did not really take. What could that even mean? She would look this up on her phone later. Spider's legs found in leg. But find nothing. Yeah, IDK. The boys think it means something Indian. Jackie smiled. She'd never seen Indian abbreviated as NDN before. Maybe he'll get powers like Spider-Man, Jackie texted. Anything like that ever happened to you? What? No. I'm going for a swim. All right, take a few moments and see if you can find anything that the dialogue is doing here, and your hint is that there is a theme present. All right, let's take a look here. So here's what I found, and this is one that maybe you could argue multiple things here, but I see that first text, Orville found spider legs in his leg, as being an inciting incident. And so I marked it as a plot event. Now you could also argue that it's characterizing Orville, okay? So it could be more than one thing. In the WTF and in the the casual way that the sisters converse here, we get to see their fond relationship with each other. And the Spider-Man joke shows Jackie's sense of humor. Now, the green here is where the theme shows up. We get that theme of identity searching, which for this character ends up being really important for her understanding her connection to her heritage and what that means for her. Our final example is quite complex. This comes from a complex book, The Traitor Beru Cormorant by Seth Dickinson. And it's called hard fantasy. It's a secondary world, but there's a lot of political intrigue and things going on in this book. And so there's quite a bit of setup here, but bear with me. As background on this story, Beru's home of Terranoke was colonized, so Beru's the main character. To try to bring justice to her people, she decides to work up the ranks of the colonizing civilization to gain power that she can then use to help her people. She is assigned as a government accountant to the territory of Ardwin. In this scene, she is drinking in a bar with her friend Aminata, who is a naval officer. Now, in this example, it's a little bit longer. I want you to see how many of the 4 things that we're talking about today you can find, and your hint is that world building is present in this section. Do you think they're going to rebel? Ardwin always rebels, Aminata shouted over the roar of the crowd. Either the dukes are happy and the people rebel, or the people are happy and the dukes rebel, or the dukes hate each other, so it's civil war. That's what the Admiralty thinks. So what do I do? Beru had shouted herself hoarse and now had to lean into Aminata's ear to make herself heard. The governor's a spineless romantic, and I think the Juris Potens is on the other side. I don't know, I'm just a lieutenant, Aminata laughed, as if this were really a joke. I want to go home. Beru slipped on the bar and caught herself on Aminata's stool. To Terranoke. I miss it so much, Aminata. All right, I'll give you a minute to analyze this, look at just the dialogue, the sections that are spoken out loud in quotation marks, and see what story purposes is each one of those lines fulfilling. All right, let's see what we have here. So I broke this into 2 pieces since it's kind of long here. All right, the green section at the top I marked as world building because we're learning about the nature of Ardwin as a region through Aminata's description. We learn about the whole dukedoms and how they interact with each other. The yellow characterizes the trusting relationship between Beru and Aminata because Beru is honestly asking advice on how to proceed, as well as her assessment of 2 minor characters. So we learn a little bit about the governor and the Juris Potens, who are minor characters who show up outside of this scene. In the second half here, we get some characterization on Aminata when she says, I don't know, I'm just a lieutenant, which implies a much different view of the world than Beru has. Aminata is not, she doesn't have the ambitions that Beru has, and she's not trying to fix the world in the same way. The blue sections both characterize Beru's driving motivation of getting her home. I want to go home. So that's a pretty plain statement of character motivation there in that dialogue. But then it's also revealing the theme of losing one's home to colonizing forces and perhaps not being able to get it back in the same way that it was before, which is one of the main themes of this book. So hopefully that was fun and interesting to analyze some texts. And I want to just pause for a second and do a quick check so you get a chance to look at your own writing in this way. So I want you to look back at some dialogue in either your quick write, or if you have a page of a current story that you're writing, you can grab that also. Or I also put an optional extension activity. If you'd rather grab one of your favorite books, if you have it handy, you can very easily do this same analysis. So I want you to try to identify a line or a section of dialogue in your own writing that you could tweak or revise to add a layer of characterization or insert a plot event just for practice. Or if you prefer, you could play with world building or theme. Or if you're choosing to grab a book off the shelf, see if you can identify a scene that really resonates with you and figure out why it's working. So deconstruct it, reverse engineer it, figure out what's there so that you can then use that as a mentor text in your own writing. So I'll give you 2 minutes just to go back and look at this with fresh eyes. You might be wondering, how do I decide what information to convey through dialogue and what to convey through narration or action? I would say use the 2 main strengths of dialogue to guide you. Dialogue is most powerful in places with high potential to characterize or allow a plot event to unfold, but it can be used anywhere you want your readers to hear the voices of your characters. If it's a boring part, consider skipping the long conversation and making it a summarized narration sentence instead, or make it less boring by upping the level of characterization and emotion in the conversation. But as always, all stories are different, so do what is best for yours. Welcome to the writing prompt section of the workshop, where you'll be able to write for an extended period of time and apply some of these techniques to your own writing. Now, because we're working with dialogue today, we're going to spend a couple of minutes creating some original characters to work with, and then I'll give you a prompt. And just like last time, we're going to write for about 20 minutes, so I'll put a little counter up on the screen. And if you're more comfortable finding a different space to write, you're more than welcome to leave your laptop and come meet us back here in 20 minutes. And if you were able to take the characterization workshop in session 1, I would encourage you to try to work in some of those elements of characterization that we talked about. So thinking about perhaps your character's backstory or their personality or their motivation to see if maybe that would tie in to this scene. And I encourage you to have fun. Grab your notebook, it's writing time. So since we're going to be writing dialogue, we're going to take a couple of minutes and just create some new original characters. And I want you to have a little bit of fun with this. So you need to think of two people and jot down the information below about each of them. So I have some character ideas here on the right-hand side. If you're not sure where to start, you might choose a traveler and sort of brainstorm from there. Or if you have a work in progress and you have existing characters that you want to explore their voice a little bit more, you're welcome to use two existing characters and play with them also. But if you're for either one, regardless of whether you're creating new ones or using existing, I want you to just briefly jot down some information about them, including geographic background, so where are they from, do they use slang because of this, their education level, and how that impacts their word, how might that impact their word choice, their age, because the amount of life experience that they have could impact their speaking style, their personality, do they tend to be an angry person, shy, depressed, etc., and the relationship. So how are these two characters related to each other? How do they know each other? And why are they speaking to each other? So I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes here to brainstorm some characters. On the next slide, you're going to be assigned a location and a situation to put these characters in. But for right now, just try to flesh out the people themselves. Hopefully you have two basic characters. Don't worry about them being perfect. We're just going to have some fun with this. Now we need to put your characters in a place and have something happening to them. So to spice it up and make it a little bit random, I want you to take the first letter of your first name and find it on the left-hand chart, and that will tell you your location. So the first letter of my first name is K, so I would have movie theater. And then take the first letter of your last name, and that will tell you what the situation will be that the characters are in. So my last name is Fitzpatrick, so I will look under F, and I will have the characters are happy with where they are and want to stay, but can't. Now, if you don't have a first and last name, or if you just don't like the thing that you get assigned here, feel free to choose anything off the chart, but I'll give you a second to find it, and do write it down on your notebook because I'm going to go to the next screen and this will not be displayed. All right, do you have it written down? Okay, so now the fun part. With your characters, your location, and your setting, I would like you to write a scene of dialogue between your two characters around your given situation. Aim to include at least 2 of the 4 uses of dialogue that we've discussed today. So those would be characterization, plot, world building, and theme. And I have those over here in the toolbox. And then we also talked about some formatting guidelines using quotation marks, having a new paragraph for each new speaker, and using italics for internal dialogue. We talked about a few tips today also in making sure that we're including information in the conversations that is new and interesting to our readers. So we're going to write for 20 minutes, and I'll put the timer up on here so you know how much time is left. Don't worry too much about getting it exactly right. See if you can let it flow. So whoever these characters are that you have created, stick them in the location, stick them in the situation, and see what unfolds between them as you write. Good luck. We have about 1 minute remaining of writing time. All right, let's come back together and see what we were able to write. So the prompt was to essentially write a conversation between two characters, aiming to include multiple purposes of dialogue. So the analysis questions that I would like you to take a look at are, did the conversation flow for you or did you get stuck? And see if you can identify where was the spot you got stuck and why. Where are some spots in your conversation that sing, that really just feel like they're exactly the way that you want them to be? They feel natural, they're perfect the way they are. And then on the flip side, where are some spots that you think feel awkward, that there's maybe just something off about it, you're not sure what, but you can tell that it needs to be worked more? And then I want you to engage in some metacognition and figure out how can you tell what is it that sparks something that says, I either this is working for me or it's not. And then pick an awkward spot and see if you can tweak it into serving a better purpose. Is there a line or two that is uniquely in the voice of your character that you feel really captures who they are? And how does their voice differ from the other characters? Now, if you chose to create new characters for this, you might not know these people very well, but what differentiates those voices from each other and then also from your own voice? So we'll talk about this a little more in our point of view workshop, but really important to make your character voices uniquely their own. And then finally, how might these techniques expand or enhance your current approach to writing dialogue? So I'm going to give you a few minutes here to reflect on these. You're welcome to write the answers in your notebook if you would like, and then we will wrap up the workshop. Finally, let's look at some takeaways for the workshop today. Dialogue is a powerful storytelling tool. The two main purposes of dialogue are to characterize and to advance plot. Additional purposes include world building and conveying theme, among many others. Try to make your dialogue as natural as possible and make sure it is doing work in your story, not just filling space. Keep it to one speaker per paragraph and keep your dialogue tags simple for clarity and to keep the focus on what the characters are actually saying. There's no one right way to use these techniques, and they will not be appropriate for every story. Add them to your toolbox and use them when helpful. Thank you for joining us for this workshop on crafting fiction. Be sure to view the other workshops in this series, which you'll see on the screen in a moment during the credits. The Community Writing Center offers a number of other writing workshops, along with free consultations on any piece of writing. To learn more, visit our website at www.communitywritingcenter.com. Thank you.